So, welcome, Jim, to Exploring the Future of Western Civilization, which is a very
Thank you.
grand title, but that is exactly what you've spent years doing, isn't it? And trying to influence it. For anyone that doesn't know Jim, I can't really do him justice with his very, very lengthy career, but he is a professor who is head of the Wisdom, or president of the Wisdom University. He's also president of the Gorbachev Foundation in the US, and previously led the State of the World Forum, or I think maybe still you do.
Yes.
Great. I suppose the thing I was really hoping to discuss with you, Jim, is that very basically the business of wisdom, about how we bring that back into our lives in a credible way, and how we integrate it with the way that we live. So I was going to say, what first made you realise that we had a problem with wisdom, and that we needed to, I suppose, legitimize it again?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors in all this. One of which is that in my own personal life, it was a discovery of how the ancients actually viewed wisdom. And in this regard, if anyone who listens to this has the opportunity to pick up Pierre Hadot's works, Philosophy is a Way of Life, or What is Philosophy, or The Veil of Isis, they would be very well served, because what Hadot points out is that we in the West, particularly since the Enlightenment, have relegated the study of philosophy, the study of wisdom, to very arcane academic institutions, and one thinks of Wittgenstein's and work in mathematical logic and so forth. But among the ancients, wisdom was a way of life. Wisdom was a way that one oriented one's existence. And that was, of course, the origin of the term philosophy. It was someone who was a lover of wisdom, and that in Plato's Academy, among the Epicureans, among the Stoics, etc., they gathered in community. They asked deep questions, and as Socrates pointed out, at the heart of wisdom as a way of life is the disposition to live in questions rather than in answers. And if you think about it in terms of basic epistemology, particularly in the West, religions are oriented around dogmatic belief. You need to believe that Jesus is your Savior, because if you don't, you're going to go to hell, for example. And in Islam, you're either a believer or you're among the infidels. So that religions are oriented around belief, faith, in a certainty that's been given by a supreme God. Science has another epistemology, but again, it's oriented around certifiable facts. Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And even though science hypothesizes and deals with different theories, it's still trying to ground itself in what is observable, measurable, and knowable through the five senses. Wisdom, on the other hand, lives in the questions, and the great genius of Socrates was his understanding that neither dogmatic belief nor scientific certainty was sufficient to bring about that which we most deeply seek, which is really personal transformation. But that somehow, if we're courageous enough to live in the questions in a dialogic way with either our teacher or our community, that we engage in what Plotinus, third century Neoplatonist, talked about in terms of, he said, the pursuit of wisdom is like being a sculptor. It's not about acquiring knowledge, it's about stripping away delusions and fears. So he gave the image of a sculptor looking at a block of marble. And what makes a marble into a statue is that which you chip away. That the pursuit of wisdom is chipping away that which is not essentially you. And that's what makes wisdom a way of life, as I understand it.
So when we kind of live it in a day-to-day basis, is wisdom our gut feeling, our heart brain, tapping into the electromagnetic space between us? Is it a cognitive shortcut? Is it universal consciousness? What do you think? Where it's not cerebral cortex logic, so what is it?
Well, I think it's in some ways all of the above. Wisdom, like love or hope, courage are easily said, but not so easily defined, so that one can discern qualities to love, but no one has really defined love in an absolute sense. So anything that I would say about wisdom would be ad hoc ultimately and temporary. But what I would say about wisdom, at least insofar as I've been able to kind of contemplate these matters, is I would say in the first instance, wisdom is the capacity to see the larger context. When you think of a wise person, they're not a person who is egocentric. They're a person who understands the ebb and flow of life. They're people who get the larger picture and therefore see themselves relative to the larger picture as opposed to absolute and therefore completely ego-centric. Most babies aren't wise. They're very egocentric, and they cry when they're hungry and they want immediate attention. And so I think there's something about maturational development toward context rather than content that demarcates a wise person. And because they see themselves relative to the whole rather than absolute to the whole, they tend to have cultivated characteristics of humility, of compassion, of sensitivity to others, because they become aware of contingency. They're aware that we are fallible creatures in a very contingent world. And then I think, thirdly, a wise person understands very deeply their mortality. Remember, Plato said that all philosophy begins with a meditation on death. And that was an understanding that was foundational to all the original wisdom school, that once one comes to terms with one's finitude, with one's mortality, then you begin to prioritize that which is important and dispense with that which is irrelevant. The meditation, if this was the last day of your life, what would you do? And you have instance after instance of people that are diagnosed with some kind of terminal cancer, say, and they're given 3 months to live. Their entire life changes, and they begin to pay attention to relationships. They begin to pay attention to the here and the now. I think that's also an aspect of wisdom. I keep, for example, on my desk a skull that I've had since I was 15, and it's next to a candle. And every day when I go into my study, I light the candle and I look at the skull and I try to internalize, even though I forget after a few minutes, that I'm a mortal man.
Yeah.
And because I'm mortal, my ultimate obligation is to love.
So, can I ask you some questions which I totally agree with what you just said. So I'm not coming at you from an antagonistic perspective, but what I'd like is your experience at arguing from the other direction. So I'd like to put to you some of the things that people say to me to see how you deal with those challenges, so I can learn from that. So, for example, if we put it in a very practical context, I'm a doctor, so in a healthcare setting, the way a lot of medicine is done is in a very, lots of things brilliant about it, obviously, but very much rational, intellectualized, technical, disembodied, and very much brilliant things from science, but also massively having thrown out the baby with the bathwater in terms of care, but the basics, of caring and so on. And a conversation I often have with people is, particularly, say, nursing staff, is we've kind of had, take this, cognitive behavior therapy, I guess you know what that is, that a type of psychotherapy, which is excellent, very good, but it's quite simple. Of all the therapies, it's perhaps the most rational, linear, apparently measurable and simple, and therefore it's testable. So in a world of evidence-based medicine, it's easiest to say this works, it's cheap, it's quick, and so on. But of course, a good clinician, and also someone who's well versed in true science as opposed to a kind of faith-based evidence-based medicine, would realize it's much more complex than that. There are lots of different dimensions. There's all that we know, there's all that we don't know. Most of science is stuff that we don't knows, and so on. But anyway, the common thing is someone will say, oh, you can't do that because it's not in the guidelines, or you can't do that because there's not a randomized controlled trial for it. We can only do what is evidence-based. And how do you deal with that? How do you say, well, actually, life's more complex than that? We operate on many different dimensions, including the wisdom level.
Well, I think that's a good question, and one looks at the modern medical complex, and essentially it's been taken over by a criminal syndicate of big pharmaceutical companies and reductionist science, and more and more, I think medical science is deleterious to human health rather than therapeutic in any meaningful sense of that term. Here in the United States, for example, we are victimized by, again, the criminal syndicate that controls the American Medical Association, controls most of the hospitals, and as Bruce Lipton said, who was a senior professor at Stanford Medical School, he finally resigned because he realized that the medical schools, again here in the United States, but I presume it's essentially the same in Great Britain and Europe, are controlled by the big pharmaceutical industries, and they're much more interested in selling products that maintain chronic conditions than actually curing people. And that's one reason why they have such a rigid, almost militaristic insistence on viewing the body as machine. I think a wise doctor coming into such a onerous bureaucratic complexity would have to ask some very fundamental questions about whether he or she belonged there. So that's one level, because I think all the alternative medicines are much wiser courses, and most of the people I know are using the alternative medicine first, and if that doesn't work, there are obviously clear cases where allopathic medicine works, but I think they're less and less effective. But at another level, what I would point out to anybody caught up in the scientific paradigm for whom there's no other box is that if you look at the latest research coming out of science in terms of quantum mechanics, in terms of cosmology, etc., what they're discovering is that everything is interconnected with everything else. And one, for example, Lynn McTaggart, who you no doubt know, has a science journalist, has really popularized the notion of intention, the power of prayer, that where two or three are gathered together and really focus on healing energy to another person. They can measure how that affects the health of the individual who is the focus of that prayer. And so I think even reductionist science is coming over and over against that which they've most excluded in building reductionist science, and that's the reality of consciousness, and how the invisible realms and the visible realms are interconnected, and matter and consciousness are two sides of the same coin, and that one's intention, one's kindness, one's prayer, one's love for one's neighbor has probably in the end a more contributive effect on healing and health than anything you're going to get through a pill. They've done studies, as you may know, where they've compared Prozac to placebos, and the placebos are showing themselves more effective in study after study.
With I mean, I'm assuming that you're not completely saying science is all rubbish, but that it's kind of something which is good, but we've over applied it, and therefore it's kind of overshot and gone into areas where it's.
I'm saying that science, by its very nature, is incomplete because it doesn't. Its basic predicate is wrong. It's like, when people believed that the Earth was flat, that worked for most people. And it took several hundred years, for people to get that the Earth was actually round. So when one is using a incomplete predicate, that doesn't mean they're completely wrong. It just means that it's basically complete. And for science, what science needs to do is to undergo its own Copernican revolution, in which it understands that the roundness of science is going to be completed when consciousness, when intention, when spirit, when the invisible and the visible are brought together and a third whole emerges that includes and completes both. That's when science will relax a little, and the tyranny of scientific reductionism, which is a dogmatic belief just like evangelical Christianity or radical fundamentalist Islam. It's another dogmatic belief, and like all dogmatic beliefs, because it insists on certainties in a world that is inherently open-ended and mysterious. It has just a long way to go.
Yeah. So it'll get there. In that process, how does the integration work? Do you see wisdom sort of fitting, kind of interconnecting with logical, empirical rationality in terms of changing the paradigm or changing the hypotheses on which science is done? Or is it like just two completely different ways of thinking running?
No. Again, coming back to my principal definition of wisdom, wisdom sees the larger context. So, for example, let's take someone like Rupert Sheldrake, a good Englishman and a brilliant biologist who's developed the notion of morphogenic fields, which has been castigated by the prevailing scientific reductionist world, but which in a couple hundred years, say maybe sooner, will be considered normative. When Einstein's physics superseded Newton, there was a kind of a lurch in the system. And there's more and more scientists like Rupert Sheldrake who are wise, who are deeply scientific, who understand the scientific model. I mean, Francis Bacon gave us this notion of the setting forth a hypothesis, doing the tests, drawing tentative conclusions. Science just needs to understand what Bacon said, that it's ultimately theoretical. And they made the mistake of thinking that they should limit themselves to only that which is measurable in the five senses. But we're learning more and more that we have much more expanded ways of knowing the world. And sooner or later, science will go through that Copernican revolution. And I believe that the next great frontier of science will in fact be the exploration of consciousness.
Yeah.
And when that happens,
yes.
boy, science will come alive for the first time.
Yeah. One of the legitimate things science says to defend, or rather those who have the, what are you calling it, the extremist faith-based reductionist mindset, they'll say, well, we don't want, science came about and we got rid of medieval superstition, all the hocus pocus potions and bizarre magical belief systems, many of which were nonsense or just either not true, wishful thinking, or even just abused by powerful people to make money or to seek control. So if we're going to say that actually we want to take wisdom back and validate it as something that we hold valid in our lives and in our institutions, the way we run our world, how do you, within wisdom, judge what's true and what's false? Because if you take the break of scientific rationality off, you suddenly get, you just have to look on the internet or go to a workshop or something, you meet all sorts of people who will say, oh, you need to have a coffee enema daily, you need to sniff this, you need to sit under a crystal pyramid, you need to do this jumping up and down and dancing, and it all comes from another planet called La. And so how do you decide what's true, what's false, what's reasonable, what's not, what's valid?
Well, I think that's highly personal, and I would just note that many of the so-called superstitions and folk cures that were banished in the face of the scientific revolution have turned out to be true. And I can still remember when President Nixon went to China, and all of a sudden the United States and the American Medical Association was confronted by the reality of acupuncture. And up to that point, the scientific establishment worldwide said that this was superstitious and it is absolutely untrue. And I can still remember on national television when they showed incontrovertibly that when you put a needle into the body, like in the calf and the elbow, you can have a patient go through an operation without anesthesia. And what we're discovering, I think, is that science basically got it wrong. And again, rather than trying to stamp out superstition and everything that is not fundamentally scientific, so-called, I think that the future of medicine is going to be integral. What we're discovering is that acupuncture, in fact, cures a lot. So does homeopathy. So does hypnotism.
But the question I'm asking is, where does wisdom come in? Because an empiricist would say, great,
wisdom is the one that holds that whole. Wisdom is one that holds the whole. And then the wisdom then from the context, for example, is of integral medicine, then would discern that there's some things that are going to be better treated by big pharma. There's some things that are going to be better treated by another discipline. And again, the wise person holds the whole and synthesizes the different factors that science isn't wrong. the empirical method isn't wrong. It's just one fractal. It's one way of knowing. For example, you come into a room. You instinctively feel an attraction to somebody across the room that you've never met. Well, that's not really measurable, but you know something. You go and you see a sunset, and you feel the numinosity of the cosmic mystery of light and color and the solar revolutions of the Earth around the sun and the sun around the galaxy, and you have this epiphanal awareness. You can't measure that, but that's deep mysticism. And I just think that as we move into the 21st century, my God, we have to come to an awareness that East and West, North and South, ancient and modern, there have been multiple ways of knowing, and wisdom starts with that multiplicity, and then within that context, on a case-by-case basis, makes discernments that are requisite and true for that particular occasion or that particular illness. I think in 50 years, we're going to have integral medicine all over the world. And a great conversation, because in the United States, nearly 50% of the entire population now uses alternative medicine. And in case after case, scientific studies, Nicholas, Prozac is being beaten by placebos. And the deleterious, destructive effect of big pharma on human health, mostly and most egregiously here in the United States, where they're even vaccinating babies on their first day of life, is becoming more and more apparent, even given the extraordinary measures that the American Medical Association has taken to squelch the information. So we have a reformation on our hands, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in that through Wisdom University, because I think wisdom is much bigger than reductionist science. At least that's my view.
Of course. Well, finally, if we suppose everyone enrolled in Wisdom University, and the wisdom was fully integrated globally, say in 10, 20 years' time, what would it be like to live in that world?
Oh, boy. Well, if anybody's interested, come to www.wisdomuniversity.org. We have a variety of courses that we hold all over the world, both virtually and in person. I would say that if the world became wise, if one could do what no avatar has ever been able to do and click one's finger and people became wise, I would say that in the first instance, we would take seriously that the climate is moving out of control, and that we needed, as a human race in the next 10 years, by 2020, to shift from a fossil-based economy to a renewable energy economy. I would think that all of us individually and as families and communities would begin to focus on sustainability. I think we would start to look at former enemies and understand that we inhabit one single planet, and there is plenty of latitude for differences within the context of deep dialogue. I think a wise world, a wise England, a wise America, a wise France would shift two things. One, the energy that we use to empower our economies and our political infrastructures. And number two, we would realign ourselves with the earth upon which we inhabit. One of the most egregious destructions of fundamentalist science is that it's treated the earth on which we live as inert dirt that we can literally do anything about. And we need to understand, Nicholas, what James Lovelock says in Gaia. Gaia, the earth, is a living organism. We are her creatures. And we have built a scientific modern superstructure on the planet that's predicated on a completely predatory, exploitative, destructive relationship with Earth and with other communities. And we are marching quickly to our doom. I mean, on the Arctic Sea, as we speak, there are now plumes of methane erupting out of the seabed that's been melting because of the receding polar ice caps. And plumes 1,000 meters wide, which is 30 times more contributive to global warming than even CO2, are now spewing into the atmosphere and producing millions of tons of methane now into the we're losing control of planet Earth, and human civilization is going to be held into an account that is going to be terrifying as the turbulence continues to escalate. And so when we talk about the scientific model, when we talk about empirical science, this is no longer a theoretical equation set like E equals MC squared. We're talking about a way of life, a mentality that has been so highly destructive that the Copernican revolution of which I speak cannot come quickly enough. Wisdom is not an ancillary, marginal aspect of human affairs. It's become, in my view, a matter of human survival.
What you just said there, obviously these are huge, massive things. For an individual person who might be listening or watching, what can they do? What practices or what things can they do in their life to really tap into their own wisdom and to contribute to the change that you're talking about?
Well, I think all of us have an obligation during our tenure on this planet to be as well informed as we possibly can. And so I would urge everyone to just become informed, watch the news, look at what's happening to the weather, understand the complexity of your world, and really spend time connecting the dots. Understand the larger context. I think all of us have a personal and familial and communal obligation to become more sustainable. Go on the website, understand your carbon footprint. Make a commitment to reduce your carbon footprint by 10% this year. Look at how you're living. Look at how you're sustaining your life. Are you engaging in right livelihood? Are you working for a big oil company or a predatory bank? How are you putting food on your table? What's your diet look like? They're very simple things that individuals and family can do to be much more sustainable, much more humane. When was the last time you went out to nature? When was the last time you really contemplated the aliveness of nature? Or do you just live in a big urban industrial city like London or New York or Manchester or Glasgow, and nature's become something that you see occasionally on television? I think the greatest teacher of wisdom is nature. And in fact, it was Whitehead that said that wisdom and nature are never in contradiction with one another. So if there's one thing I would say to anyone looking at this program is spend as much time in nature, feeling the aliveness of Gaia, and she will teach you. She will lead you to wisdom.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you so much.